This is the Ramana Maharshi 40 Verses on Reality Satsang, a time for self-reflection and self-inquiry. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. I'm Richard Clarke, hosting this satsang. Welcome. I am a seeker like you, sharing what we love. I have been blessed with years of deep teaching and practice. I bring this to you in this satsang. This week's reading from 40 Verses on Reality is verse 12. That alone is true knowledge, which is neither knowledge nor ignorance. What is known is not true knowledge. Since the self shines with nothing else to know or to make known, it alone is knowledge. It is not a void. Knowledge and ignorance are both for the mind. Ramana is talking about what knows the mind, what illuminates, lights up the mind. Who or what knows the mind? What is the source of the light of your own consciousness? Does it need another source of light to know? Or is it illuminated by its own light, self-effulgent? Knowledge of your own existence is true knowledge. So-called knowledge from the mind is indirect knowledge. In true knowledge there are no divisions such as ignorance and knowledge. True knowledge is non-dual, without pairs of opposites. What is known by the mind are objects, physical and mental, gross and subtle. The mind's sensory knowledge is indirect, moderated by the senses, forming an image in the mind. What is known through the mind is indirect and filtered. It is shaped by desires, fears, and conditionings. What is known by the mind always is centered on the I thought, the imaginary character that we assume ourselves to be. The mind is indirect since it does not know itself. The mind does not provide its own light of consciousness. Rather, it reflects the self-effulgent light, which is who you are. This self-effulgent light is what illuminates everything, including the mind. Mental knowledge is all relative, based on its relationship with this imagined person. This is not true knowledge. True knowledge never changes. It is knowledge of your existence, knowledge of the self. It is self-known. There is no other light. That is why my teacher Nome says, only the self can know the self. Ramana ends with, it is not a void. It is not void since it is filled with consciousness. If you see or feel a void, emptiness, or blankness. This is known. Who is the knower? This knower is not a void. The Buddhists say this too, declaring empty but not void. Now some notes for practice. You know that you exist. By what light do you know in the waking state? What about when you're dreaming? Who is the unknown knower of all that is known? Now to our videos for the week. First is Swami Sarvapriyananda, and he's asked, what is knowledge?
I've heard you say, and I've read that the universe appears as bubbles in my consciousness.
Yes.
And given that, sometimes I find when I'm in class, I think to myself, well, here I am, surrounded by myself, and there's me, talking to me, teaching me about myself.
Yes.
Given that, what is knowledge?
Knowledge is that which removes an ignorance in a particular mind. The ignorance has what, there is an appearance of duality here, right? Even after knowledge, the appearance of duality will not go away. But the appearance of duality will be seen as an appearance of duality. The underlying unity will be understood clearly, without any doubt. So you and I and all of us are one. And it's not crazy to talk about it like that, because I know I have attended classes in the Himalayas where the Swami starts the class by sitting, Mere Atma Swarup Sab, O all ye who are my very self. You have come in this way. Even mundane things. In the Himalayas, there are what is called Bhandara. Bhandara is a big occasion for monks, where monks are invited to feasts. Rich people give money and a nice meal is cooked and you invite monks. Now it depends. You can't invite all monks because there isn't enough food. So some of these Bhandaras are limited number. You have to have RSVP, or what do you call it? Yes. And they will go around. There is such and such a feast and such ashram on such and such date. Now, how many people from your ashram will go? How many monks will go? So instead of saying monks, they use very interesting language. Kitne murti? How many forms are going? The reality is one. How many forms are going to go? How many murtis are formed? How many forms shall you be? There's a funny story about Swami Brahmananda. I mentioned Swami Brahmananda had gone to Kashi, the hospital, with Holy Mother. And so everybody would gather around him and meditate, and he would talk to them. It was such an exalted atmosphere. Nobody wanted to go anywhere. And so an invitation came, as it does, for a bhandara, for a feast in some other ashram. And nobody wanted to go. And the head of the ashram felt very discomfited, because if he doesn't make a good showing, he will lose face in the sadhu samaj, in the committee of monks. Nobody came from your ashram. What? You don't want to come? You don't like us, or what? So he went to Swami Brahmananda and said, Swami, everybody comes to you early in the morning, and tomorrow we have an invitation to a feast and nobody wants to go. They all want to sit in front of you. What do I do? And Swami Brahmananda said, don't worry. The next day they all came. All the monks, they bowed down to him. And he said, stand in a queue. They all stood in a queue with hands folded. Now he said, about turn. And they turned around. And now off with you, march off to the feast. And they all marched up to the feast. So they had a big turnout. It's an imagined duality. And the knowledge removes ignorance there. Before this imagination, that it's an imagined duality, it's a very real duality. You see the duality and it's very real. The non-duality seems to be theoretical. After the Advaitic teaching comes, it removes the ignorance in our mind, and then the appearance which continues is recognized as an appearance, not anymore as a real duality. And that removes the sorrow. You see, the sorrow comes from the reality, not from the appearance. The greatest of tragedies, the most evil of people, the most horrible things are acceptable where? Even enjoyable. Where? In fiction, in theater, in a movie, in Hollywood. Correct. Even the worst of things, you'll enjoy it and you'll give it an Oscar award. For a fraction of something, a person would be locked up if he actually tried to do it in the world. Would be hauled up before the International Court of Justice in The Hague or something. But in a movie, you give it Oscars. Why? Because the sting is taken out when it becomes art, it becomes enjoyable. Even horrible things, let alone enjoyable things. For an enlightened person, only from his point of view, that person's point of view, nothing is really horrible anymore. That does not mean he'll be cold and cruel and calculating when it comes to others. When others are suffering, he'll be all help, all comfort, all sympathy. From his own point of view, it's a play. That's why I say if you claim enlightenment, you have no right to complain anymore. If you claim enlightenment, you have no right to complain anymore. One person came to Belur Mutt and he was Australian. So he had a strong Australian accent. The Swami who was sitting in the inquiry, the Swami is a especially short Swami, and this is especially big Australian. Australians are big, and this is especially big Australian. So this gentleman had to kneel down, and the Swami was sitting in the chair so that they could be on the same level. Even then the Swami couldn't understand what he was saying. He called me and said, look, you know English quite well. You talk to this person. What is he saying? And turned out that the gentleman was saying that he had visions of Christ, of Krishna, of Ramakrishna, and they're all entered into his body. I said, fine, that's wonderful. I mean, it's beyond my league. The only person who can help you is there. I pointed to the Ramakrishna temple. He's sitting there. He can help you. I mean, it's way beyond my league. But what's your problem? Let me ask you. That threw him. Problem, well, he looked unhappy. He said, well, actually, I feel it's all coming to an end and I don't want to die. Oh, really? You don't want you have experienced Christ consciousness and Krishna consciousness and Ramakrishna consciousness. You know that you are the infinite being and everything. And this particular body, you're afraid it'll die. That's your real big problem. And then he looked confused and he thought, oh, maybe I gave him matter for thought, and he went away.
And next is Rupert Spira, and his talk is There is not nothing, there is experience.
Well, in the Vedantic tradition, what is called self or I is understood to be the Param Atman, the infinite awareness. And the Atman, or the self, that each of us considers ourselves to be, is a reflection of the light of the Paramatman in each of our finite minds. So the I that each of us feels, now everybody now feels I, or myself. That I it seems to share the limitations of the body, and thus seems to be temporary and finite. But this I that each of us feels is in fact a reflection in the mind of the only I there truly is. God's infinite I, or the I of the Paramatman. So that is why the feeling of being, or the sense I am, is considered to be, is so important. It's why I am is considered the holy name, the sacred name, because the sense I am in each of us, or the feeling of being, is the portal. It is the mind's access to its reality. It is why Know Thyself was written above the temple of Apollo at Delphi. To know thyself, to know what we mean by I, or I am. Although the I the I that each of us considers ourselves to be seems to be limited. That I is, in fact, the only I there is, the I of infinite consciousness. So that means the very awareness with which you are now aware of your experience, although that awareness seems to be limited by your body, is in fact the only infinite awareness there is. Just like the space in this room seems to be limited by the walls of the room. Yes, if we were to ask most people, what is the dimensions of the space in this room? We would say that it's 10 meters by 15 meters. In other words, it seems that the space in this room shares the limitations of the room itself. And if we believe that, we believe that in the world there are innumerable spaces, each room being its own confined space. But when this building is taken down, nothing will happen to the space inside it. Indeed, nothing happened to the space when the building was put up. Imagine the world before there were any buildings. Yes, imagine the universe. There was just one space. There is only one space, physical space in the universe. Yeah. And then each time a house is put up, the space seems to be contained and as a result to share the limits of the house. So it seems that there are innumerable spaces or innumerable houses on the earth. But when all those houses come down, the space will remain exactly as it has always been. It was never really divided when the buildings appeared. And it doesn't suddenly reunite with the outside space when the building comes down. Nothing ever happens to the space. It's always been the same single, indivisible, and relatively speaking, infinite space. Well, consciousness is like that. It seems to be enclosed by each of our bodies. And as a result, each of the consciousness, the awareness with which each of us now knows our experience seems to be limited by and to share the destiny of the body. Just like the space in us seems to be limited by and share the destiny of the building. But it doesn't. The space in this room is the same infinite space that it was before the building was put up, and that it will be when the building is put down, taken down. It won't be destroyed when the building is destroyed.
That's why the great ones say before they leave the body, and people are very upset, where can I go?
Yes, exactly. Where can I go? Because awareness, I was never incarnate, that is, I was never in the body in the first place. The space in this room is not incarnate in this room. It is not in this room. This room is in fact appearing in the space that it seems to contain. So the I in each of us, when we say I am aware of my thoughts, I am aware of my feelings, I am aware of the sound of this voice. The I that is aware seems to be contained within and to share the limits and destiny of the body. But in fact, it is the body that is contained within it. So when the Buddhists say there is no self, if by that they mean there is no temporary, finite, separate self, there is no limited space, the space in this room is not really limited. If they mean that, then we agree. But if they mean that there is no, if they deny the existence of the space itself, if they say that objects and awareness co-arise together, then we're not in agreement. If by emptiness they mean that no object has its own independent existence, then we agree that all objects borrow their apparent existence from the reality of consciousness, just as the landscape in the movie doesn't have an existence of its own. It borrows its apparent reality from the true reality of the screen. But if they deny the reality of the screen itself,
Even if it is meant that there is no such a thing as self as a separate entity, that is not correct in the true understanding, because we know it's interrelated. You understand what I'm saying?
the self is interrelated, do
Yes,
you mean?
because the self in me is the same as the self in you, and it's related to
Yes,
the Paramatma.
so there is no real discrete self. There's no self with its own independent existence. The self of each of us is simply an apparent limitation on infinite, the only self, if we can call it a self, there is. Now the reason in this tradition we call it the self is because the self is the name that each of us gives to ourself. We talk about myself. When we talk about that which is most intimate in ourselves, we call it myself, or I. So I, or the self, is a good name for that which is essential to what we are. I mean, we have to call it if we're going to speak of it, we have to call it something. And in this tradition, the words self or I are considered good names because they already refer to what we consider ourselves to be essentially. It's true that the word I or self usually implies something personal or limited. So in that sense, the words I or self are not so good. And in fact, the word God is at the other end of the extreme. If I is considered to be that which is most intimate and personal, God is considered to be that which is most vast and infinite and impersonal. So for that reason, God is a good word, except that in our culture God is at a distance from ourselves. So both these words have qualities that are true and qualities that are misleading. Whatever we call it, something is. There is experience, yes? We must all agree on that, whether we're Buddhists or Christians or atheists or agnostics. We must agree that there is experience. There is not nothing. It's true that experience may not be a collection of things, but even so, it is still not a void, that there is something. And the question is, what is that? It's true that all our language describes the parts, so we don't have a word for the whole. But we do the best we can with our language to describe what is the reality of that which is experienced. Experience is real. This might be a dream. We can't be sure we're not dreaming. We might be having a kind of dream. Because when we dream at night, our night dream appears to be as real as the waking state does. So we can't be sure, just as when we dream at night, we think we're in the waking state. Then we wake up and we realize, oh, I was dreaming. We can't be sure we're not dreaming now. But even if we are, there is still a reality to this dream. Just as the Caribbean beach that we were sunbathing on in our dream last night was an illusion. But nevertheless, there was something real about that illusion. What is that? Even if this is an illusion, even if it's not an outside world, It is something. There is something real. All experience is real. Have you ever had an unreal experience? Would it be possible to have an unreal experience? It's not possible. All experience is real. A near-death experience, a vision of God, a toothache, a vision, a cup of tea, or a dream of a Caribbean beach. All experience is real. The question is, what is that? What is it that is unmistakably real about experience? And whatever we call it is not important. What is important is that our words evoke it as accurately as possible. And we should be very careful to discriminate between viewpoints that just use language in different ways but are actually saying the same thing, and viewpoints that use the same language but are in fact saying different things.
Yes, I'm tending to think that, in my perception, that actually it's just a matter of words, but it's about the same thing. But if you keep on studying more, then you get to feel that there is really an essential difference. And this I cannot understand, because those who have come to self-realization, or those who have reached Buddhahood, they've come to the same realization.
Yes, it's true. Everyone who the recognition is the same recognition in all cases, but don't think that everybody that writes and speaks about these matters, although their language may be similar, is talking about the same thing. Don't buy too easily the belief, oh, all these teachings are different fingers pointing at the same moon. Some of them are, and some of them aren't. And you have to be discriminating. Even on the relatively small field of non-duality, there are many now that with this recent proliferation of non-duality, contemporary non-duality on the website in the last 5 or 10 years, there are all kinds of ideas that superficially are similar and turn out on further investigation to be very different. Panpsychism is the most common one. Panpsychism, the belief that consciousness is in everything. Superficially, the belief that consciousness is in everything would seem to be consistent with and identical to the consciousness-only model. And in fact, many physicists now who are open to the possibility that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality have added consciousness to their materialistic model. And they think that consciousness is somehow, that all of matter has a degree of consciousness. And this is panpsychism, the belief that consciousness pervades all of matter. But it appears to be what we're saying here. It's not. The panpsychism it's a materialistic belief. It starts with matter, and then it adds consciousness to matter and says that all matter is conscious to a greater or lesser extent. First of all, it starts with the belief, I, the body, am aware. It is this body that has consciousness, that consciousness is an attribute of the body. And then if we start there, we think that dogs and cats also have consciousness. And we go further and we think that snails and fishes and slugs and worms and fleas also have a degree of consciousness. And then we go further, trees and plants and grasses have consciousness, and then maybe even concrete and metal has some degree of consciousness. And we end up with the belief that everything has a degree of consciousness. And as a result of this belief, we believe that one day we will make a conscious computer. And this is where the artificial intelligence is based on the belief that it starts with the belief I, the body, am conscious. And if consciousness is an attribute of the body, then it's only a matter of time before we build a computer that is conscious. But it starts with a mistake. The mistake is it's not I, the body, that is conscious. Consciousness is not an attribute of the body. It is consciousness that is conscious. Only awareness is aware. So human beings are not aware. Dogs and cats and fishes and snails and fleas and amoebas and grasses and plants are not aware. Computers will never be aware. Only awareness is aware. So this is just an example. Sorry, I'm getting carried away. This is an example of an idea, and it's not for no reason that I say this, because it's very prevalent in the science and non-duality scene at the moment. This apparent mixture of science and non-duality. Panpsychism is really the forefront of this mixing of science and consciousness studies. It's considered to be the kind of cutting edge of where non-duality and science meet. But it's a mistake. It's based on the fundamental, the original mistake, I, the body, am aware. So that's a very good example. You'll often hear people saying there's consciousness in everything. And this sounds similar to what we are saying here, but it's not. If you look at it closely, it's not. It's a materialistic view.
But if you turn it around, it's true.
Yes, it's not that consciousness is not in everything, because there are no things with their own. To say consciousness is in everything is to grant things too much existence. To say the universe is conscious is to grant too much existence to the universe. It is to first presume the existence of something called a universe, and then to add a quality of consciousness to it. It's the wrong way round. We have to start with consciousness. Why? Obviously, it is our primary experience. Consciousness is what is first in experience. So if we want to build a model of reality, we don't start with the universe and then ascribe consciousness to it. We should start with consciousness, the simple reason that it is our primary experience, and then see how something called a universe appears in consciousness.
But then it's a matter of language, because without consciousness the flea would not be, the bee would not be.
Sorry?
Then it's a matter of language, because without consciousness the flea would not be, or the tree would not be alive. Then instead of...
Yes, but no, that's true. The flea or the tree derives its being from the only one that truly is. But that's another thing from saying that consciousness pervades the object.
But if you say
The screen doesn't pervade the image. To say the screen pervades the image, you first have to start with the image, and then say the screen pervades it. But what is the image independent of the screen? There is no such thing called an image that is pervaded by the screen. The screen does not pervade the image. There is no such independently existing thing called an image that may or may not be pervaded by a screen. There is just the screen that appears to itself as the image, and as such is made of the image, as such is made of the screen. But there is no independently existing thing called the screen.
And now we have Nome, and Nome's talk is Self-Knowledge is Non-Dual.
Self-knowledge is non-dual. That is, in this knowledge, which we refer to as self-realization. There is no differentiation of a knower, the knowing, and the known. That is to say, in self-knowledge, your own existence or being is the knowledge. And the self that is known is not an object. And the one who knows is not an individual entity. The Upanishads declare Tattvamasi, that you are. That meaning Brahman, or the Absolute, which is the self. The declaration is that you are that. Not that you are someone who can stand apart from that, to be ignorant of it or to conceive of it. Self-knowledge, therefore, is not something perceptual or conceptual. It is something else entirely. The self to be known, or Brahman, is not an object. The knowing is not perceiving or conceiving when it comes to self-knowledge. How all this is so is easily comprehended if you examine, deeply inquire into the nature of the knower, that is, yourself. The individual does not realize the self. Only the self can know itself. And if the self knows the self, there is nothing else to be known, for that alone is the abiding reality, or pure existence. In order to know the self as it is, to abide steadily as that, the Maharshi recommends, he gave instruction in inquiry, saying that one should give up the objectivizing outlook, the tendency to see oneself as an object. Give up the objective outlook and inquire as to who you are. When you identify yourself as an object, such as unnecessary limitation or bondage, and from that bondage, due to misidentification, comes any kind of suffering. To eliminate suffering, eradicate bondage. To destroy the bondage, eliminate misidentification. To have misidentification cease, simply inquire as to who you are. If you misidentify as an individual, or as a mind, or as a body, all of that is clinging to the objective outlook. It is taking that which is non-objective, your being, and imagining it to be something. Whatever that thing is, in whatever form it appears, in truth it can never be the formless. The formless alone is eternal, for every form is subject to destruction, a birth and a death. The formless alone is eternal. As the Maharshi points out, the eternal is alone worth seeking and realizing. And the eternal is that, the real self itself. And only the eternal can know the eternal. Only the self knows the self. So if you attempt to meditate or spiritually practice or to inquire, from what position are you attempting to do so? The purpose of a practice, any kind of practice, is to dissolve the false sense of ego and every false definition appended to it. So when we inquire to know the self, we do not grasp, as it were, for an object, the self, as if your self was apart from the self. For there are not two of you. There is only one of you. Rather, making one's vision non-objective, actually inquire as to what your nature is, what your very existence is, and cease to misidentify with a body or any of the attributes or activities of a body, with a mind or any of the states or modes or thoughts of the mind, and cease to misidentify with what the Maharshi refers to as the I thought or I notion, the concept of existing as an individual entity, which we commonly refer to as an ego. All such misidentification is merely imagined. And when that imagination is given, as it were, the solidity of your own reality, it seems as if solid, as if it were the case. Just as darkness can be said to be dense darkness, even though there's really nothing there. If you inquire, that's like bringing light to dense darkness. What happens to the darkness? Being insubstantial, it simply vanishes. It is like that with all of our bondage or ignorance. If we simply inquire to know who we are, the bondage, the misidentification, the ignorance vanishes.
All right, now we will take a few minutes to meditate, to inquire, and breathe in and out long, slow breaths. Notice the breath as it comes in, as it goes out. And notice that you exist. You exist, and you know that you exist. Now investigate within yourself. Who knows all this? Who is the unknown knower of all the known? Do you know yourself? Can you not know yourself? Who am I? What is the nature of my existence? All right, let's conclude with a short chant. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Thank you for letting me share this teaching with you. This series on Ramana's 40 verses on reality will continue in the following weeks. If this satsang was of interest to you, I have more for you: a free book site, a YouTube site, and my blog. The URLs will be on screen next.